that comes to an end.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.
Welcome, everybody, to the Al-Masdar podcast. This is our second installation. I'm your host, Brad Blankenship, joined in the studio with my colleague, Brady Bernard. Today, we're joined with Norman Finkelstein. Norm, you've come under a lot of scrutiny for your statements against the Israeli government. Generally, do you think that there's a sense of servility present both in your field and in general amongst the academic community?
No, not anymore. I don't know how familiar you are with the American scene, but things have changed dramatically over the last decade or so. The college campuses, probably the most active student political engagement is on Israel-Palestine, with Palestine being favored and Israel in very much disfavor on college campuses among students. Among faculty, most of the main humanities divisions which intersect with Palestine, beginning, of course, with Middle East studies, they're overwhelmingly supportive of the Palestinians. In fact, the evidence of that is, if you look on college campuses now, they have established all of these bogus disciplines and centers. So you'll have a center for the study of anti-Semitism, or you'll have this discipline called Israel Studies, or you'll have this discipline called Holocaust Studies. The reason all of these things have been concocted is because the Israel cause has lost out in the mainstream established disciplines. So wealthy Jews are called upon by, say, the Hillels, the B'nai B'rith, are called upon, can you give us money so we can establish an Israel Studies program or a center for the study of the Holocaust? And so these billionaire Jews cough up the money, and these centers are established, but they're testament to the fact that in the mainstream of college life, Israel's stock has plummeted in the last decade.
Mm-hmm. You kind of in your own work and the whole famous discourse between you and Alan Dershowitz, there certainly was, I think anybody familiar with that knows that there was a certain bias for his side against yours.
What's the bias on his side? There was a vendetta, or as Professor Chomsky put it, he launched a jihad against me because I exposed him in a way that he's not accustomed to. He is accustomed to either being thrown softball questions by sympathetic interviewers or people who defer to him because of his Harvard pedigree, or they are afraid of him because he is known to be very vindictive. And I did not fall under any of those categories. I wasn't a softball pitcher. I wasn't going to defer to his Harvard pedigree, and I wasn't going to be afraid of him. And so he was not prepared by what happened, but when it did happen, he launched a vendetta against me in order to exact revenge, and in part, he succeeded.
So that was more of a personal battle rather than one on the issue.
Yeah, I would say it had a large personal element to it. I met him recently in an Indian restaurant, and he commented that after what I said about him on the program, he said, "What did you expect me to do?" Which was actually, on his part, was an honest response. He wasn't even claiming that what he was saying about me was true. He was effectively saying that in retaliation for having said those things on the radio program, what did he expect except that he would launch a relentless campaign to destroy me?
Right, and you've kind of I've heard you say you kind of draw that back to his lawyer background.
No, I think he was unprepared for it. Professor Dershowitz has said and done many outrageous things in public life, and people never call him on them. So to take the most obvious example, it was clear that he did plagiarize. Even though I don't consider plagiarism to be the cardinal sin, nonetheless in academia it does rank as a cardinal sin. And two of his colleagues at Harvard, Charles Ogletree and it's funny, I just had his name in front of my mind, it just slipped. Ogletree and Lawrence Tribe, at the same time as him, they were also accused of plagiarism. They had to pay some small consequence. We don't know what it is. Harvard kept it a secret, but they had to pay some consequence, some price. He never pays any price. He is accustomed to going his merry way, lying to the left of him, lying to the right of him, into the valley of the television set. He lies uninterruptedly, but he never pays a price. But I did kind of, at least among a certain cult following of mine, who seems to watch that particular interview every Saturday night. Like in New York, they used to show the Rocky Horror Picture Show every Saturday night for cult followers. He did get embarrassed by it. He suffered some small price. He paid some small price, and he was determined to get even.
You mentioned that he wasn't prepared, and kind of similar to you, whenever I've seen Dershowitz talk to Chomsky, for example, in their debates, those seem to degrade kind of into personal attacks. He'll say something along the lines of, "Oh, well, here in Planet Chomsky, he just expects you to take what he says for granted."
The difference between myself and Professor Chomsky, and Dershowitz has always said he will debate Chomsky still, but he won't debate me. The difference is twofold. One is a personal element. Dershowitz obviously deeply envies Chomsky because he's of that tradition, the Jewish tradition, where there is nothing more revered than the Jewish scholar. The equivalent of the rabbi, but in the secular world, is the Jewish scholar. And Chomsky clearly he ranks as the one of, if not the most eminent intellectuals in the world today. So Dershowitz envies that position of him, and if he debates him, it's as if to confer on him, meaning Dershowitz, the status of being Chomsky's equal. I obviously don't occupy the same space as the rarefied space of Professor Chomsky, so debating me is just a step down for him, meaning Dershowitz, so he won't do it. The second reason is it's the Chomsky style. Chomsky can be attacked from the left and from the right, and he will always stay on the pavement. He will never walk into the gutter. I am of a different sort. If you want to go into the gutter with me, I'll go into the gutter with you. I'm going to come back, I'm going to come back swinging, and you're not going to get away with it. So even though Dershowitz will use the Planet Chomsky locution and Chomsky won't respond, I will respond. And Dershowitz knows I'll respond.
There was one debate between him and Chomsky I saw, it was a couple of years ago actually, and he was making these bombastic claims against Chomsky, and Chomsky pretty much told him, hey, just just email me after this, and I'll just send you my sources, which he keeps up pretty well with that. So what did you mean by going through the gutter?
I will speak with an element of candor and frankness, which Chomsky wouldn't.
So I watched your interview on Russia Today about the stabbings in the West Bank and kind of the implications of that. Where do you think the conflict has evolved into the present day? Obviously, I see reports, seems almost weekly, of atrocities committed. Do you think that these have escalated in recent years?
No, there's been one ongoing atrocity in Gaza, for sure. And at some point in the future, I think what was done and continues to be done to the people of Gaza will actually mortify humanity if it's remembered. Let's say 2 million people, 90% of whom are either refugees, 80% of whom are either refugees or children of refugees, half of whom are children, in this besieged, blockaded enclave, which has to sustain for the past 10 years a blockade, illegal blockade imposed on it by Israel. And then periodically, this period has been punctuated by these murderous massacres, which actually you have an inverse ratio. They escalate in intensity. So take, for example, the last Israeli assault on Gaza. In Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, 6,300 homes were destroyed. During Operation Protective Edge in July-August 2014, 19,000 homes were completely destroyed. And if you look at all the other basic indices, the picture is roughly the same that what happened in Gaza. I think in Operation Cast Lead, 350 children were killed. Operation Protective Edge, 550 children were killed. So the massacre that periodically punctuates this illegal, immoral, inhuman blockade, the massacres escalate in intensity, but the international community has become so inured to them and to the lunatic prime minister of the state of Israel that the actual media coverage and media fallout has significantly diminished. If you recall after Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, there were literally hundreds, and that's literally the case, hundreds of human rights reports that were published. And then there was the huge hue and cry over the Goldstone report, the report chaired by Richard Goldstone, the South African jurist, who's also Jewish. In the case of Protective Edge, there were barely any human rights reports published. Human Rights Watch published almost nothing. For Cast Lead in 2008-9, it published 7 reports. In this, almost nothing. The Human Rights Council, everyone knows the name Richard Goldstone. You couldn't even name, if I asked you, who was the person who chaired the Human Rights Council report on Protective Edge. Her name was Mary McGowan Davis. She's a complete non-entity. The report was absolute rubbish. It was just a complete disaster. It got no media coverage. So, in the case of Gaza, the massacres have escalated in intensity while the blockade continues in its daily brutality. The media coverage, however, has diminished significantly. The case of the West Bank, between the use of the Palestinian Authority collaborators and a very clever strategy by the international community of buying off all the talent in the West Bank by setting them up in these NGOs in the Ramallah area. Whoever has a brain on his or her head and seems like he or she might one day become a troublemaker, a leader, they're given this NGO some office with a computer and a desk. You get set up. You're getting an NGO salary, which is to say you're living at a much higher lifestyle than a typical person in the West Bank. And you, of course, are completely conscious every minute of every day that one wrong word and you might be back in the real West Bank, not the Ramallah bubble. And so between the collaborator army and torturers, army and jailers and torturers, the NGO setup, and the absence of any alternative organization, a large part of the Palestinian population has been reduced to despair and looking out for him or herself or his or her family. And so the level of resistance is on a much smaller scale than in the past. And if you know the expression, wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. But on the other side, if there's no resistance, there's no need for oppression.
You mentioned Human Rights Watch. It seems, as any of our listeners are familiar, we take a lot of criticism to Kenneth Roth in particular, with his coverage of Syria, his selective reporting on certain incidents. In this case, in Palestine, do you think that, as we suspect in Syria, do you think that there is a narrative amongst Human Rights Watch and other human rights groups?
You can see it from the bad side or the good side. So, or I should say, the bad side or the extenuating side. Human Rights Watch wants to have an impact on policy. Otherwise, what's the point of a human rights organization? Is there any point in just documenting? Not really. I mean, I think there is a point in documenting. That's what I do. But that's not what a human rights organization wants to do. It wants to affect policy. So to affect policy, to some extent, you have to be on the inside so you can lobby. And so part of it is, I can understand it, that you figure if you want to be effective, you have to be able to talk to Obama's people. And if you just relentlessly attack, you won't be able to talk to them. And Roth is an insider. I guess he used to work for the federal government. I think in the judiciary, I can't remember where. He's an insider by nature. That's the good side. The bad side is that you effectively take the administration's agenda on issues that count for it. You know, any administration has, any American administration has a position on everything in the world because you're the global superpower, so you're poking your nose in everywhere. But in some places, it makes no difference. The administration is not really wedded to any particular line because no major U.S. interest is at stake. So in those areas, a human rights organization can tell the truth. But Then there are areas where U.S. interests are at stake. For example, Syria. And then you have to, if you want to play that game, you have to tread very carefully. Human Rights Watch occasionally, I would say outright, I have to be careful about that. I don't know how much you read their reports, but I'll tell you this much. The reports are almost always factually accurate. Or if something is not factually accurate, you can see where they're stretching the facts. That's not the problem with these reports. The problem is not the factual reportage. The problem is when you get to those legal interpretations. And that's where Roth enters the picture. Roth will take out his red pen, so to speak. We don't use red pens anymore. And he will start twisting and turning the law in such a way as to make it more palatable to the government, except in areas where the government has no real stake or interest. So there is some in Papua New Guinea. There is a rape or a murder or a political murder. They'll get the law right. They'll say this is a war crime. They'll get the facts right because the U.S. doesn't really care what's going on Papua New Guinea. But where it's a major interest, my experience has been the problem has not been mostly. It's not been with the factual reporting. It's with the outrageous legal interpretations that are given the factual reporting by someone like Roth.
Yeah, that was our last guest actually, Mushtaba Masood. We were discussing that same point that you're mentioning. So I'll read the human rights reports, for example, and these places, these countries that some people have never heard of, and you read them and they seem accurate, but when it comes to, for example, the execution of Sheikh Namir, there was very little on that from Kenneth Roth on his Twitter account and even on Human Rights Reports. So I don't know if you heard on Christmas, Zehran Aloush was killed, the leader of Jais al-Islam. Roth said that it was part of Assad's strategy to limit the choices between him or ISIS. And some Twitter activists got him to backtrack that claim because, as Mr. Masood put in his documentary, Aloush had called for the genocide of Shia and Alawites alike. So for him to claim that this person is essential to peace talks in a democratic Syria, and also he said that he believed democracy was a farce in pushing this Salafi agenda. So it was kind of misleading, if not an outright lie, for Mr. Roth to claim that Zehran Aloush was some pillar of democracy that was killed. So these are some of the things that we've noticed on the Syria end.
Right, but you'll agree that's an interpretive issue.
Yeah, I mean the facts aren't wrong on that. It's
no,
the narrative.
They have that sense of there is that sense of number one, an internal sense of professionalism, and number two, they're perfectly aware, especially in the internet web age, that if they misstate the facts, they can be caught lying. Whereas the law is so almost infinitely flexible that you can never really pin it down and say that's a lie. It's hard. The law is so malleable, it's so flexible. And that's where Roth comes in. The conclusions he sometimes doctors, and I mean doctors, the legal conclusions. When it comes to Hezbollah, they're just mind-boggling. Mm-hmm. Hezbollah and Hamas, because they're Islamic, and these are liberal, secular human rights organizations, which is to say they hate religious people. They think, they're of the what's that guy's name? Oh my goodness, where's my Bill Maher? Religious people are the stupidest people on earth. If you believe in religion, you must be a moron. There are some of the smartest people in the history of humanity, probably the majority of the giants in human thought, they happen to be religious. Whereas my guess is Bill Maher, he never got past chemistry and biology to physics. So for him to be expressing such certainty that religious people are stupid, whereas he probably has 2 years of high school science, I don't know where these people come off. This presumption on their part. But when it comes to Hezbollah and Hamas, the stuff they write is so ridiculous. I mean, I'm telling you, the legal stuff they come up with. They come up with stuff, just to give you one typical example. Let's say Israel says it's going to target a home. It's going to blow it up in 5 minutes. So the person, the occupant of the home, then calls on the neighbors, come up to the balcony of this house and protect us, act as protectors for the home that's going to be targeted. So Human Rights Watch, and now the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, you know what they say that is? They call that's illegal human shielding. Human shielding. You're willing to sacrifice your life to prevent yours or a neighbor's home from being blown up by this lunatic Mongol army, and you're guilty of human shielding. What is that? What is that? But that's what they do. That's what they do. Because it's Hamas and it's Hezbollah. These crazed religious fanatics.
I definitely have to agree with you on that one. We actually recently tried to debunk the whole mythology of Madaya. They were claiming that Assad and Hezbollah were blocking food entry to Madaya and starving these people. And what they failed to really address was the overwhelming amount of evidence to the contrary. There was videos all over Twitter. There was testimony from people living in the city that in fact it was actually Al-Nusra and other rebel groups that were occupying Madaya, or al-Sham as well. And they were pegging it and saying it was Hezbollah.
It's written a convincing account of what's happening there.
It's actually really hard to get to really pinpoint who it is. But I watched the story last night.
Has Patrick Coburn commented on it?
I know that Murad Gajdiv of RT has, actually.
Mm-hmm. RT, unfortunately, is not what I would call a trustworthy source. First of all, they have me on. Actually, they're the only ones that have me on. And I don't think that's going to last very long.
But I watched MSNBC, right? And I watched their piece on it, claiming that Assad, the same narrative that's shared all over the Gulf states, both on the right and left of the United States. But they didn't have any comments from anybody that lived there.
Well, I honestly don't know. I know that the Saudis are right now gunning for Nasrallah.
Yeah.
So they are, I think, pulling all the stoppers, buying off everybody in order to write stuff against Hezbollah. So I'm a little bit wary. There's this creep in London named Azam Tamimi.
Yep, we know him.
Yeah. And he's now gotten on the Saudi bandwagon. He's a complete lunatic, in my opinion. And now he's a lunatic for hire. So, they're all doing that now in order to get this Saudi money. Because basically, Nasrallah, who for years was very coy in his criticisms of Saudi, now has re-Christianed the Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula. Because he says it's an illegal usurpation by a family of a country.
Actually, even though I'm not in the habit of quoting Dershowitz, he did come up with one line which I have to admit I like. I suspect it's not his. He took it from somebody else, but I have to give credit where credit's due. Somebody referred to the Gulf states once, and he said, those are not states. Those are family-owned gas stations. That is true. That is true.
So you mentioned Nasrallah and Hezbollah. That's actually something I was going to segue into. Are you familiar with what happened in Damascus, where Samir Kuntar was killed by Israel?
Yeah, and Kuntar is an interesting case because he's been completely demonized, whereas an Israeli intelligence person admitted when Kuntar was released, he admitted that all the claims against Kuntar were false. So he was demonized again at his death, whereas if you go back, and I think it wasn't in Haaretz, it may have been in the other Israeli paper, Yediot Ahronot, that in fact all the stories about how he took these people hostage and killed them in cold blood, they just weren't true.
Yeah, it seems to always be that narrative to kind of demonize Hezbollah. I believe, and you're probably familiar with, Nasrallah released a statement pretty soon after that, saying that they wouldn't let that go unchecked.
Yeah, but he always issues those statements. There have been a number of high-level assassinations, and he always speaks about exacting revenge, but at his time and his place. So I wouldn't attach too much importance to that.
So let me get your opinion on this. So you mentioned Hamas and Hezbollah. It seems that there's kind of a disconnect, especially from Hamas, with the axis of resistance. For a while there, Hamas kind of fell off of the axis of resistance, kind of to the disappointment of Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah, kind of trying to go their own direction.
They never go in their own direction, unfortunately. They go where the money is. I mean, they're not in a position, beggars can't be choosers, and they're not really in a position. So, at the time when they underwent reversal, they desperately needed Egypt, and Egypt was anti-Iran. So they went with Egypt, and of course, hoped for the Saudi money. That's just very narrow options.
Well, they kind of, especially Hezbollah and Hamas in the context of Syria, have taken completely different stances. Yeah. Hamas has came out and supported the rebels. Hezbollah has kind of, obviously taken a big role in Syria, fighting alongside the Syrian Arab Army. What do you really think about that as far as those two stances? Do you think that
I think neither of them had good neither of them had good choices. Hamas, because at the time it was dependent on good relations with Egypt under Morsi, and Hezbollah because it's dependent on the passageway between Syria and Lebanon. They need Syria for the arms. I wish they had better choices, and sometimes I wish that Nasrallah had distanced himself more from Bashar. I wish he had distanced himself more, but I recognize that he didn't have that many choices, and he's a very smart man, and so he knows he paid a very big price. He was by far and away the most popular political leader in the Arab world at the time of the 2006 Lebanon war, and now his stock has plummeted. The Syrians loved him. They really did love him. And now they hate him. And he lost a lot of moral stature.
by backing Assad.
If you look at South Beirut, I mean, it's a very vibrant community.
He lost a huge amount of support. I knew a lot of the people who loved him, and they hate him now. The Sunni Shia thing, it never spread to the West Bank. Palestine. I lived there. Nobody ever talked about Shia Sunni, even up till today. It's not Shia Sunni, it's who's got the money.
Right.
To think that Hamas is acting, even Hezbollah, I mean.
So you don't think that was sectarian?
Right, but there they had the confessional system. The idea of a confessional system, it would be totally alien to the West Bank and Gaza. Nobody ever talked about Shia, Sunni. So I don't think that was the animating factor. The animating factor was you need allies. And unfortunately, in the Arab Muslim world now, you have a choice of Iran or Saudi Arabia. Those are the big players. So you have to choose between them. Not at all. Hamas? No. Okay. I mean, even, let's be clear, even the Hezbollah Syria thing, Hafez al-Assad, he was a fanatical secularist. Remember, 1982, in Homa, he killed about 25,000 Muslim Brotherhood people. So the thing that it's a religious alliance between Syria and Hezbollah is crazy.
Oh yeah, I think just the whole axis of resistance, Hamas, Hezbollah, kind of dispels on its, kind of on its face the whole sectarian belief and mythology of the resistance. Mm-hmm. It might not even be accurate to call it an Islamic resistance, as many do.
Islam, it is a binding factor in the case of Hezbollah and Iran. Yeah, it is a Shia factor. But I think that one has to look also at the anomalies within that arrangement. There was an arrangement between the, oh my God, my memory is going. In Iran, what are the holy people called? Okay, let's just say the Ayatollahs and Hafez al-Assad. That's a very strange arrangement. So religion goes only so far in trying to explain these alliances. The mullahs in Iran, okay. And the Ba'ath Party. Now, that's weird. And the Ba'ath Party. And then the two most warring countries in the Middle East in the 80s and 90s were not just Iraq and Iran, but Iraq and Syria. They hated each other, and they were both Baathists. These explanations have, I think, limited. They have some, but they're of a limited value in trying to understand the political dynamics. In the Gulf, it has nothing to do with Sunni. First of all, how can anyone possibly believe that these Saudi parasites who spend half their time in brothels and the other half the time in liquor stores, that they care about religion? I mean, every time I hear about, Saudi Arabia and its Wahhabi conservative religion, Saudi's religion? Is there anything more ridiculous? It has nothing to do with religion. Religion is just a rallying cry. They want to keep their wealth. They're parasites.
There's many of us, we're trying to, understand why the execution of Sheikh Namir, they obviously knew there would be ramifications for that. And a lot of people have said they think it was more or less just to divide Shia and Sunni even farther, to kind of make the choice for other nations and other peoples to say it's either us or Iran.
Look, I'm no defender of the system in Iran. There are a lot of problems there. However, I think since Saudi Arabia was created, they have not contributed anything to humanity. I've never seen a country like that. You can attack Israel to the end of time, but you have to, acknowledge its technological achievements, its cultural achievements. There's something. What is there in Saudi Arabia? What has there ever been in Saudi Arabia? It's a nation of parasites. And you can't say that about Iran. Iran has a very sophisticated technological infrastructure. Very smart people. The sciences and math. And the humanities has been a disaster because of the reign of this lunacy. But
Maybe they have long enough history and culture that maybe this would just be seen as a passing phase, 40 years. Mm-hmm. But Saudi Arabia is a zero. A monster. It's a monster country. They use their money to buy off everybody, and they'll do anything it takes, so they can keep hold of that wealth. Of course, American ruling elite that describes any ruling elite, these maniacs with their money. But you have to say there are different facets to the American system. It's contributed in various areas. It's made significant contributions. You can differ on how significant they are, but nobody's going to deny in areas of science, technology, culture, and so forth. There's something. How much, we can disagree on. But Saudi Arabia, what has it ever done?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Norm. This is your host, Brad Blankenship, signing out. And again, Norman, thank you so much for the interview.